All right, so is everybody ready to talk about clauses and complex sentences? That's the topic of today's notes. Okay, so we're going to start out by just reviewing, and I would like you to try to match up the terms on the left to their formula and synonym on the right, and pause the video at this point so that you have time to think about this, and then press play when you're ready to check your answers. Okay, so you should have come up with simple sentence. The formula for that is A, one independent clause, and the formula for a compound sentence is D, two independent clauses. Synonyms for independent clauses would be B, simple sentence and main clause, and synonyms for dependent clauses would be C, fragment, subordinate clause, or relative clause. So that's a review of some of the grammar ideas and concepts that we have covered so far. This is a really important one too. With each of the types of clauses and sentences, we've really focused a lot about how to punctuate them. So which of the following is not an acceptable way to join two independent clauses together? Please pause the video right now and pick your answer, and when you're ready, press play. Okay, so the answer is you cannot join two independent clauses together with just a comma, because that would create an error known as a comma splice, which is bad. Okay, so on this one, the top half has 4 rules for punctuating dependent clauses that we've talked about. 2 of them go with subordinate clauses and 2 of them go with relative clauses. And then there are 4 sentences underneath. So you need to match the dependent clause punctuation rule with the sentence it goes with, okay? So like, for example, the Halloween party was a blast because all of my friends were there. First thing you want to do is find the dependent clause in the sentence. After you've found it, decide whether it's subordinate or relative, and then pick which punctuation rule goes with that sentence. So go ahead and pause the video, and when you think you have your answers, press play. Okay, so the Halloween party was a blast because all my friends were there. Because all of my friends were there is the dependent clause, and it is subordinate, and it goes with the second rule, which is when a dependent clause occurs last in a sentence, it should not be preceded by a comma. And then the next sentence, the Halloween party, which I have heard was a blast, had many attendees. The dependent clause is which I have heard was a blast, and that's a relative clause. It's functioning as an adjective describing the party, and it is not essential information to the sentence, so it is set apart by commas. So it goes with the 4th rule. When a relative clause contains information that is not essential to understand the sentence, it should be set apart by commas. The 3rd sentence says, since all my friends were there, the Halloween party was a blast. And the dependent clause there is since all my friends were there. It is a subordinate clause, and it starts the sentence, so it goes with rule 2. When a dependent clause occurs, or with rule 1, I'm sorry, when a dependent clause begins a sentence, it should be followed by a comma. And then the 4th sentence, the Halloween party that I attended with my friends last night was a blast. The dependent clause is that I attended with my friends last night, and it is a relative clause, and it goes with the 3rd rule, which is when a relative clause contains information that is necessary to understand the sentence, it should not be set apart by commas, okay? And that I attended with my friends, that is on both subordinate conjunction and relative pronoun lists, but remember, then you have to decide, is it functioning as an adjective or an adverb in the sentence? And in this case, it's functioning as an adjective describing party, so it's a relative clause. Okay, so moving on to the notes portion, now that we're done with the review of the tough terms, a dependent clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, but it is a fragment. It will begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, And just a couple examples of a dependent clause that begin with each one of those would be on the bottom there. Even though she kisses turtles, whomever loves turtles more. So just a reminder that all clauses, dependent and independent, must have subjects and verbs, and relative pronouns like whomever are often the subject of the relative clause. Okay, so a dependent clause will begin with a subordinating conjunction, in which case it makes a subordinate clause. We've already talked about this. Or it will begin with a relative pronoun, in which case it makes a relative clause. It will not form a complete sentence. That's why it's called dependent, because it depends on a main clause to be complete. And readers will want additional information to finish the thought. So this is the new portion of the notes. So it's really important. Everything that we're doing grammar-wise really builds on, each step builds on the next. So in order to understand complex sentences, you have to have a firm understanding of what simple and compound sentences are. And you also really have to understand the difference between dependent and independent clauses. And you need to be able to identify those, which is why we memorize those conjunction words. So sentences are called complex, which we abbreviate CX, if they are composed of one dependent clause and one independent clause. And actually, you can have more than one dependent clause in a complex sentence, but you can only have one independent clause, okay? So I guess you could say for the formula, complex sentence equals one or more dependent clauses plus one independent clause. And there's an example at the bottom. I do not like green eggs and ham because I dislike food coloring. So you have the independent clause in black and the dependent clause because I dislike food coloring in green. So just to recap the differences between the sentences. Simple sentences consist of one independent clause. They are the most simple of the four types, which is why they're called simple sentences. Compound sentences consist of at least two independent clauses, at least two, but they do not have any dependent clauses. Neither do simple sentences. And then the complex sentence, which is our new one, is one independent clause plus at least one dependent clause. And the dependent clauses can go anywhere in the sentence or the formula, but the punctuation for those clauses varies depending on where you put them in the sentence. Think about the 4 punctuation rules that we just reviewed. So here's an example of a simple sentence, which is one independent clause. Gus-Gus is a happy mouse. And an example of a compound sentence, Gus-Gus is a happy mouse, but he has quite a temper. Now, in place of that comma but, we could have also put, remember, a semicolon or a conjunctive adverb, semicolon, adverb, comma, and it would still be a compound sentence. And then an example of a complex sentence would be Gus-Gus attempted to get the cheese from Lucifer, even though Lucifer was much bigger and meaner. So you have the dependent clause at the end, independent at the beginning. Since the dependent clause at the end is subordinate, you don't put a comma before the clause. Okay, so now you guys have these practice exercises in your notes. I'll walk you through the first one of each exercise, and then I want you to finish the rest on your own. Okay, so number 1 in practice time 1 says underline the dependent clause in each sentence, then label the subject and verb in each dependent clause. So number 1, turtles have a hard shell that protects them like a shield. The dependent clause would be that protects them like a shield, and the conjunction is that. That is the subject also, and protects is the verb. So a big clue that this is a relative clause is that the relative pronoun that is the subject of the clause. Okay, so you guys can finish the rest of these. Let's move on to the next practice section. For this section, you're going to punctuate each sentence correctly, putting commas where necessary, and also underline the dependent clause, please, and identify if that clause is a relative clause or a subordinate clause. So number 1, after Amy baked the birthday cake, she served it to her guests. After Amy baked the birthday cake is a subordinate clause, and since it starts the sentence, it needs to have a comma after the word cake. Okay, and for the last section, you're going to identify whether each of the following sentences is simple, compound, or complex. And I want you to write S, CD, or CX just over to the left, excuse me, to the left of each of the numbers, okay? So, like next to number 1, you would look and see what the sentence says. The dog barked and yowled while the rabbit chewed. Well, if there are not any dependent clauses in that sentence, I know it's either simple or compound. Then I just have to figure out how many independent clauses there are. However, in number 1, there is a dependent clause, which is while the rabbit chewed. So I'm going to underline that and label that as dependent. And then I look to see the dog barked and yowled is an independent clause, so I'm going to label that as independent. So my formula for the sentence is independent plus dependent, which I know is complex, so I'm going to put a CX to the left of number 1. Okay, so just label the independent and dependent clauses, if there is a dependent clause, and then to the left of each number, write what type of sentence it is. Okay, so please be ready for me to ask you questions about these practice exercises, as well as about the video as a whole when you come into class. And if you need to rewatch, please do so.